Welcome, I am Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. I am really pleased today to have as my guest Mr. Joel Christensen, Professor Joel Christensen of Brandeis University, where he teaches classics and does many other things. I was trying to remember how I first met Joel, and I can't recall the instant, but one thing he's done in the world that has really been wonderful is he's done Reading Greek Tragedy Online, a series of you can find them on YouTube. They're Greek tragedies presented by actors and produced for the screen, for the small screen, I should say. And I use it now, Joel, just kind of like a library. Like if I want to be like, oh yeah, I forget what's Ion about. You know, I can just look at your thing there. He also has an amazing Substack blog dealing with the Iliad, and I'm tempted to say it's a deep dive, but that's kind of a phrase we use. It's more, I mean, a dive, you go down and you come back. Joel, I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, but it seems to me like you're really living in that story in a beautiful way. So I do that as well. I live in stories, so that's why. That's one reason Joel and I are connecting. So anyway, Joel, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. And thank you for talking, saying nice things about the stuff online. But I think you're right. I don't know how I would describe the Substack. I don't even know what a Substack is really for, except I like the way I'd put it is sort of living alongside a narrative. And also, there are two parts of it. One is bringing together ideas and resources for people who want to engage with the Iliad, but also sort of chipping away at my own re-experience of it, right? So each sort of post is a different thing, and it's sort of keeping me sane. Like I have a history of turning back to Homer when the world seems a little wild, and trying to sort of make sense, the sort of that triangulation between experience of the world, memories, and story that helps us process it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a way to find our way,
Yeah.
these stories. A guy I know, he's about probably in his 70s now. I asked him once, "Oh, do you know the Odyssey?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, I love the Odyssey." And then he said, "I see with it," And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh yeah, that's
That's a
good."
good way.
Like he sees the world,
Well, I
through it.
love it. It may be just serendipity, but sitting there, watching you play the guitar and thinking about a passage I was just looking at in the Iliad. It's from book 18, but this will make sense in a minute. When the embassy comes to Achilles in book 9, they find him playing the lyre. And the line is Ton Delron. They found him, Terpomenon formingi ligea, delighting his heart with the clear voice lyre,
Yeah.
which is, and people have been like, is he just distracting himself? But I think the right argument is that he is framing the world through the stories he knows. And the
Mhm.
crisis for Achilles in the Iliad is that the stories he knows don't match the experience and feelings he's having. So part of the crisis of epic is that not all of the stories that we have actually match up to the stories we're going to live.
Mhm. Yeah. Right. Oh, that's rich. So let's slow down a little bit. Give us that
Sorry.
Greek again. I love it. Give us the
All right, let me see if I can
formingi.
get it right. Wait, so it's Ton Dalron. Here, wait, let me look it up because I missed the heart part
Yeah.
in book 9. Let's see if I can find that
Well,
one
while you're looking, I'll
quickly.
just say to our listeners, we're not going easy on you. We're just jumping right in. I'm saying, you mythical listeners who are real, I
Okay,
know. I'm just gonna.
I
Oh, go ahead.
I
Uh,
missed the frena, so it's ton deran frena teparmenon formingi ligea. Right, so they
Ligeia.
found him delighting his heart or thoughts, depending on how you translate frena,
Yeah.
with a clear voice lyre.
Yeah, that's great. So,
Yeah.
just to catch everybody up, so this is in the Iliad when Achilles has stopped fighting. He's like, I'm not going to fight. And they send an embassy, which is, here we go, Joel, let's go. It's Odysseus, it's Phoenix, right? And then Diomedes, I think, right?
No,
They all.
Diomedes calls for it at the beginning. It's a Odysseus Phoenix, and you'd be forgiven for forgetting this guy. It's Ajax the Greater, Telamonian Ajax, and
Right.
he's the one who doesn't address Achilles directly. He's the
Yeah.
third speaker, and he looks at Odysseus and is like, "Let's get out of here. This guy has no feelings at all in his heart."
Yeah.
And that's sort of like, we were talking about kids before. Like when you have a little kid, if you like talk about them but not to them when they're misbehaving, it's that act of shaming that
Mhm.
locks them out of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. So what's interesting to me is that Achilles is singing songs about the deeds of great heroes, right?
Yeah.
He's not singing. It's not like he gets off the battlefield and he's like, I want to watch what we would call a sitcom or something,
No, no.
or I want to watch a satyr
Well,
play.
in the word, the Greek is really clear, right? The second half of the line that talks about what he's doing repeats that delighting his heart, except it's thumon e terpen. He was delighting his thumos, which is like his emotional organ. And
Yeah,
then the second half is aede daraclea andron. He is singing the famous songs of men, which seems like it might be an anodyne phrase, but it's so marked in the epic tradition. It's exactly what Phoenix says like 300 lines later in book 9 when he says to Achilles, I don't understand how you're behaving. This is not what we've learned from the Clea Androne. And this is definitely marked as stories from the heroic tradition.
yeah.
And so, what Phoenix emphasizes there directly is the basic assumption of Homeric poetry, which is that stories from the past are supposed to be used to help you understand and act in the present.
Yeah, yeah. And that's my understanding of story. I mean, once I heard the amazing sort of teacher and storyteller Martin Prechtel. He's a
Hmm.
Pueblo indigenous fellow, studied shamanism in Guatemala for 15 years. He was approaching a microphone. He was about to tell a story, and it was kind of under his breath. Somebody was like, "Oh, and here's Martin with the story," and he got up and he just said, "A story is a ritual map to a territory of the soul." He
Hmm.
said that, and it took me like, I'm still like absorbing
Yeah,
that.
you're
A
still
story
thinking
is
that.
a ritual map to a territory of the soul. So that's the idea of a map has really helped me because I mean, it's not
Hmm.
the territory, but the Odyssey is a map of coming home from a war,
Hmm.
And it's not the only map, and there's lots of ways to traverse a map, right? You can maybe skip part of this part and go here. So it's more liberating than like strictly linear narrative where you start at the
Well,
beginning, go to the end.
what I like, so I love that for many, many reasons, but I want to talk about a map first, right?
Hmm.
So a map, right, is not reality. It's a representation of reality. Like, right, if you're saying a map, a story is a map, right? You're distilling the full experience of a story down to discrete points that can be described, right? But the full experience of a story is the traversal of those points, like how you get from all of them, and they can change from person to person and from journey to journey. Right. Because let's, again, maybe getting too metaphorical here, but if you're taking your commute to work, right, every day it's the same points, but it's never the same experience,
Hmm.
right? The speed is different, right? The other people on the road are different. You are different, right? In the Heraclitean way. And that map is fascinating because it implies progress to a point, but
Hmm.
it doesn't encapsulate the full experience of the story unfolding once it's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And you, I mean, as someone who's a professional storyteller, I mean, I imagine like the audiences shape you, the context shape you. So you may go and you're telling the same story, but it's never going to be the same story at any given time as it was before.
Right. Yeah, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, I've told the Odyssey. I'm not sure this was a good idea, but I told it to kindergartners one time, and I started it, and I one week it was like an 8 week thing at a school, and I started it, and they were so desperate. I mean, what really struck them was the absence of the father, and
Yeah.
and so I had to satisfy them by having the father come home, and
Hmm.
anyway, so I told that story and emphasized the magic and the monsters, of course,
Of course.
but then I tell it to adults, and of course, then the betrayal, the death, all the other things, they feel it
You're
in a
just
different way.
Yeah, speaking straight to my heart on this one. I think you may remember from our last conversation how my own relationship with the Odyssey changed from not loving it to teaching it like 3 or 4 times in the same year. So in the same 18 months that my wife and I had our first two kids, and my father died,
Yeah,
and realizing how much capacity for loss, capacity for love, your position in the world and relationships change the way you view a story. But I love the fact that you mentioned kindergarten kids because no, because children have a capacity for story and understanding how story works that we as adults often forget. Right.
Mhm.
And one of the ways I know this is true is in the new book I have about story life and the old one I talked about before, I use what is really a simple concept from cognitive approaches to literature that I've tried out with younger kids, like as young as fourth and fifth grade. And this is the cognitive blending theory. And what I say is, look, you and I hear a story about a hero rescuing a princess from a castle, right? We hear, and this is like the map thing, we hear the same basic data points, but our experience of the story is a blend between our experiences of the world, our experiences of other stories, and the information we're getting in that story map. So each one of us has a unique and separate story that's going on that's not the story that's being told or the story that other people are listening to, but it is what is happening for us. And what is amazing is you say that to kids, and sometimes they may say, well, I don't understand what you're saying. But then you say, well, what does the princess or hero look like in your story? What does the castle look like? And you start to tease it out, and they understand right away, like what took literary theorists like 2000 years to sort of get a grasp of, which is that whatever storyteller's putting out doesn't map perfectly onto what audiences hear. And that's okay because part of the vibrant nature of stories is that ability to adapt and change in every different circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they live in that way, you know.
Yeah.
And these days, when we're so beset by authoritarian regimes, be they political or cultural, you know, it's I mean, there's a continuum with like film. I mean, film is wonderful, right? I mean, it makes amazing creations, but it's imaginatively, it's very authoritarian, right? I mean, there's no
Yeah.
the audiences are passive receptacle, right? And then
Without
from
a
what
doubt.
yeah, I mean, as you described, you know, we all may imagine a different castle, a different princess, you know, which is very, very liberating, you know.
Well, I love that you bring up film immediately because I totally agree with you. And film does have different types of ambiguity and meaning. It functions, very differently from other stories. But I always use, because people understand this pretty quickly, the example of your favorite story or novel turned into a film or show. And why, no matter how good it is probably going to upset you. And it's because of the cognitive blending, right? If
Mhm.
I'm reading, I don't know, let's pick a show that's actually pretty good. When I was reading The Three Body Problem by Lou Schifrin,
Mhm.
right? It didn't map at all onto what the TV show was, right? The people look different. And the thing is, visually, we're dominated by the visual sense for evolutionary reasons. But when we're reading, we don't like if someone says, oh, hero went into a bedroom, like you and I are probably not going to visualize the bedroom, right?
Mhm.
We're going to do maybe it'll be our bedroom or a generic bedroom. But when it goes on the screen,
Mhm.
somebody made a choice to populate every square foot of that bedroom with things. And that's distracting because our eyes go to the things,
Mhm.
right? Not to the story, right? When we're listening to a story or reading a story, we're following the main points, but there's a tyranny of the visual sense.
Mhm.
And so I think you're right. It's authoritarian. And sometimes it's not even meant to be. It's just based on our biology. Our eyes see things, it disambiguates what was ambiguous, and then delivers information that you don't actually need for the enjoyment of the story.
Mhm. Yeah. And the other thing is a spoken story can be different every time, as we sort of
Mhm.
were saying, you know. So like if it's raining or if it's winter, I mean, the same story on a July day at a picnic told by a storyteller is going to be different from like
Right.
January at a campfire in a yurt, you know, surrounded by snow,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So so it's interesting to me, Joel, just because I mean, you're way into, in a wonderful way, the textual history of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and just the language, you know, the beautiful
Mm.
language which we already heard come out of your mouth, you know, Andra Moyenipa, right? Um,
Yeah.
but and that's wonderful. But for example, I know a storyteller in England, Daniel Morden. He's amazing, and he does the Odyssey and the Iliad with another storyteller. And I asked him about the hanging of the servant women in the Odyssey, you know,
Mm.
because that's at the end. Listeners to this, you know, right? It's in the story. Odysseus, you know, kills all the suitors, and then he has Telemachus, and they kill all the servant women. and I always struggle about, oh, should I leave it in, leave it out? And this wonderful storyteller, Daniel Morton, who I've learned a lot from, he was like, I just take it out, and he was like, I take it out because the story has to change and to serve the audience I'm with now, and it doesn't resonate with me or my audience, so I take it out,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
which
No, and it can be, that was, I don't know if you saw the movie The Return,
not
which
yet,
came out
but
recently.
yeah,
Well, so they make some strategic decisions based on the audience.
yeah,
I think, and the way that visual violence resonates differently from described violence in the text.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, what I've tell the Mahabharata, right, which has these huge battle scenes, and
Hmm.
people have told me they saw things through my story, my telling of it, that they wouldn't want to see on a screen,
Right. No, right.
because you have some control there,
Right.
But
And an instance like violence against women, right?
mhm,
It's much harder to see those types of images than it is just to know they're happening.
yeah,
And that moment in the Odyssey, they're compared to birds, right? It's struggling on a line, and it's visual, and it's effective, but it would be a very different experience from seeing on the screen
mhm,
a dozen women hanged.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the thing about oral storytelling is like we can have, thousands of different versions of that scene and of the Odyssey, right?
Right.
If we were so wealthy of storytellers, which we aren't right now,
Well,
but
there's a thing, you probably know Plato's dialogue, the Ion, right, about the rhapsode, right?
yeah,
And there's that great part in it where at the end where he's talking to Socrates about why it's important that he pay attention to the audience, right? And he says, I'm always looking at the audience because if I make them cry, then I'll go home smiling because I made money. But if I make them laugh, then I'll be crying because I lost all my money.
mm,
And then he says, I know how to make speeches that are appropriate to an enslaved person, to a woman, to a general. And then he messes up because Socrates traps him into saying he could be a better general than an actual general.
mm,
But the point is that even in Plato's time, they acknowledged that storytellers had to be keyed into the occasion and the context, to the needs of the audience and the expectation, and that you have to be able to shift.
yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, the DVD on your computer doesn't care who you are, right?
No,
It's
no.
like definitely not, so but Joel has written this book. I want to say you've written this book called Story Life, which is speaks to some of the things we're talking about,
Mm.
where from my limited reading, I have not read the entire book, but you come to a place where you begin to acknowledge story as a living being. And at the risk of asking you to do a song and dance you've done before, how did you get to that place
Whew.
for you? I mean,
Well, so I'll just say straight out that this is a COVID book, right?
mhm,
In a couple ways. One, I started to refine some of the ideas during the early part of the COVID pandemic. And then I actually wrote the sample chapter, the final chapter of the book, and the proposal while having a COVID fever. Like sick for 10 days. Like I wrote it all out. So I suspect maybe the virus wrote the book,
mhm,
but that's sort of an extreme take on it. But for years, like my bread and butter in teaching has been teaching myth and getting students not to focus on what's the right version of a story, but why does anybody tell a specific version of a story in their context, right? Famous examples I always give is, in Homer, Oedipus finds out that he married his mom, but then she kills herself, and he has children with somebody else and goes on living just fine, right? Whereas in Sophocles, he blinds himself and all of that. So, what is the contextual difference that would privilege one detail over another?
mhm,
Or a simpler one in Homer, Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin, kills Agamemnon when he comes home and stays with Clytemnestra, and Orestes kills him. Whereas in Aeschylus, the play by Agamemnon, Clytemnestra is the one who does the murder, right?
right.
And there's
And
something going on there,
yeah. And let's
you
not
know?
forget Helen, right? Who, according to Stesichorus, right, was
Yeah,
didn't even go to Troy.
it's replaced by Cloud Helen and stayed in Egypt for the entire length of the Trojan War.
Yeah. So these stories have multiple versions and they live in
Right.
multiple.
Right. And so students are always the way we train students. And I think this goes back to Plato and some of the authoritarianism that you mentioned already. The way students are trained coming out of high school is what's the correct version of the story and the correct interpretation because I want to do well on the exam. And so for years, I've been experimenting with different metaphors for how stories develop. Right. Most people dip into myth have probably heard about Campbell's monomyth, which is, this pattern that people select from. I found that unsatisfactory for many different reasons. And so I've talked about stories as a type of DNA for a long time, and that any story tradition has different elements that can be activated by the needs of its audience. And so whilst not all students understand epigenetics, right, one of the things I'd always thought about was what is the ecosystem for narrative, and how do we understand why certain details are activated in certain environments and not in others. And so I found it useful because kids come with rudimentary understanding of genetics, and so I can talk about it. But the thing they rarely fully understand, and most of this is cultural reasons, is that evolution is not teleological, right? Is that we end up with certain things just because they happen to work at the time, not because they were the best option. All right. And so I present these ideas in class. I've been thinking of them. And the thing that really is, so jumping back to COVID, I think we had our first conversation during COVID. I did reading Greek tragedy online there. And I sat like we're sitting now in front of a computer, watching the world dominated by bad stories. Right. I mean, we saw COVID unfolding. We heard from the CDC, from best scientists, how to mitigate it. And then we had a president and administration that denied it. Right. And we're living in this, 5 years later now. We want to get rid of vaccines, where we're in denial about climate change. And so my response to that was that everyone was saying, oh, we need to get the facts out there. People don't understand the facts. And I said, well, actually, they do. They're just rejecting them because they don't resonate with their worldview. They have a narrative system that forces them to reject it. And so my thought during COVID, and the thing I'm constantly thinking about when we're facing, existential threat of climate change, is that our problem is not science. Our technology is not the problem. It's plenty advanced. Our problem is that our science of story is insufficiently advanced. The people who need to understand what story is doing to them can't, because we're not educating them, we're not talking about it. And so I started to think of what if I take seriously the idea that story functions like a life form, right? And so, we talk about viral things all the time now. So that was a facile thing to talk about. But I started reading more about evolution and virology. And I came to sort of two sides of an argument, right? The soft form is that story functions like a living thing in the way it adapts and changes and recombines with other elements of the world. And then the hard version of it is story is actually alive for all intents and purposes. It has agency of its own. And rather than focus on who's telling stories and what they're doing to us, we should instead focus on how stories develop and how we're vulnerable to it, and how we can train people and educate people so they can understand the impact story has on their lives. And so that was sort of like the outer frame. And then I said, okay, well, this is going to sound like a crazy thing. Like, how do I explain it to people in a way that's persuasive? And so I thought, well, look, I'm going to do a couple things here. One, I want to decenter notions of authorships by giving models for where story comes from that don't involve like people sitting down and writing it. Two, I want to make a plausible case that complex narratives can come from simple parts. And three, I want to get to be able to demonstrate how stories that have good effects in one context can actually have negative effects in others. And so I said, well, look, I'm a Homerist. I'm going to go out on a limb with all of this biological stuff, so I should stick to what I'm an expert in and show how Homeric poetry functions like a living thing to start, and then move to myth. So to cut to the quick summary, and then you can interrogate me, I start out by showing how Homeric verse and poetry develops from genes, small packets of meaning that unfold in different contexts, have vestigial structures, carry histories with them. And then I move to meta structures to argue how these smaller lines combine in doublets, triplets, and ring structures to make composite bodies of meaning that actually reflect a sense of our cognitive engagement with literature. And then I move to larger models. In one chapter called Crabs in the Monomyth, I make the argument for stories developing in different contexts without necessarily genealogical content. And I talk about Iliad, Gilgamesh, and John Prine in 3 chapters. So 3 chapters, 3 pages. And then I go to models from symbiosis, mutualism, as well as parasitism, to think about how dependent we are in story, how we've evolved as a species along with it, and how this has both positive and negative outcomes. So that's sort of the overall arc. Sometimes when I describe it, I think, well, I'm a crazy person. But then I go back and I think, well, actually, like, this is descriptive in a way that's useful and ends up in a place that helps us at least understand what's happening with certain story traditions in a way that I don't think I understood before.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. All right. We'd all just need to chew on that and like
Sorry.
walk around the block and come back. That was good. That was good. Yeah. I think the part of you that thinks you're a crazy person is a part we all have,
Yeah.
because we are not a single thing, we're not, we're many voices in us.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's interesting. I first came across the idea that a story was a living being or should be treated as such through indigenous folks and through my limited experience, through the fellow Martin Prechtel, which I mentioned, also through books, Joseph Bruchac, indigenous teller. And also the idea that if it has a agency, if it should be treated as a living being, then you should thank it, right? And you just as I mean, our environmental problems, right, broadly stated, come from thinking that we're the smartest thing around and everything else is either dumb or dead, like we can rip it out of the ground because it's just coal, and we can cut the tree down. And so if we're going to break that down, we need to be in relationship, not only with the natural world. And from what I know of traditional storytelling around the world, the stories were treated in that way. And you would offer to them, you would literally, I mean, Joel, you and I are both people who make our bread and butter from story in a way,
Yeah, without a doubt.
So the hard question is like, are we willing to really live that and really be like, thank whatever it is, thank the Iliad, thank the Odyssey. I mean, I think if I can put on the hat, I don't want to speak for a culture that's not my own, but if I can imagine what those folks I've heard from those folks is you make an offering, like you go give cornmeal to the story. You find a tree in the woods, you give it, you give wine, whatever it is, you give a gift which hurts a little bit, for you. It's not just, for me, like writing a poem on a piece of paper, giving it to the story, words are easy. I can write words.
Yeah.
But if you ask me to give like, $20 worth of chocolate to the Iliad, so I say that, and there's a voice in my head too, which is saying, oh, crazy person, but that voice is the same one which has us, fracking the shale and all that. So I too, certainly for me, psychologically, it's healthy to consider story as a living being because it relieves me of some of the stress. Honestly, it's
And I think, as you're putting it, and I don't know these indigenous traditions, I wish I did, but what I'll take recourse back to is the ancient Greek model, which again, when you have the muses, right, they are the authority for the tale, right? And there are a couple things to think about with this, right? Beginning of Hesiod's Theogony, when he says, the muses came to me and said, hillbillies and shepherds, we know how to tell a lie that sounds like the truth and tell the truth when we want to. Mortals don't know the difference. All you can do is receive the tale and interpret it, right? It's coming from us. But the one I like more, but this companion to that, is also in Plato's Ion, right? It's the metaphor of the magnet. And so Socrates is talking to Ion because Ion's claim is that he knows how to perform and interpret Homer better than anybody else. And Socrates is trying to figure out whether that's a skill he's learned and can teach other people, or it's something that comes from elsewhere. And eventually he proves that it comes from elsewhere. And the metaphor he uses is a magnet. And he says, look, the muses are like that Heraclean stone we call the magnet. It exerts its force through a chain link that also puts the same force through a chain link and then moves the third chain link after that. The muses are the inspiration. The poet or the first singer is the first chain link. You, the singer, are the second, and the audience is a third. So when you're inspired talking about Homer, it's not you who's talking about Homer. It's the magnetic inspiration coming from the muse that moves everything in the chain that's linked through
Hmm.
time to that original evocation. And
Yeah.
so in that one, and I talk about that like once in the book, but that's a way of attributing authority and origin without claiming it for yourself. And
Hmm.
sometimes you can say, well, it's a humble brag, right, or false modesty. But I think sometimes we should take it seriously, right? Like these are powerful, world-shaking narratives, and yes, singers are adapting them and changing them and manipulating them, but we're putting the onus, we're putting the credit on what came before, on the tradition, on the inspiration, not on the self. And there's something about that that I find beautiful, but I also find attractive because it recognizes that the power is imbued through a chain link of performance and reception.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. The magnet. Wow.
Well, and of course, Socrates says, "Oh, the magnet is God," right?
Hmm.
But I think more, in a postmodern sense, I think God there is the collective experience and knowledge of the human race and everything that's integrated with us, right?
Mm.
It's that's where the inspiration is coming from. That well that's so deep we can't see the bottom. It's so broad that we don't even know it's there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also, I mean, thank you for laying that out. That's beautiful. The thing is, it's also not something we own, right?
Yeah.
Um, and books are deceptive because you're sort of like you can have it on your shelf and you're like, oh, here's the Odyssey. I own it.
Yeah.
And not only
Yeah.
do you own it, but you can control it in a different way. You can open it and shut it. You can put it on a
Yeah.
shelf. You can leave it in the rain. You know, I mean,
You destroy it. Well, I think you're pointing right there to part of the corrosive relationship to story that we have in the modern world. And there are two
mm,
things that I often think of. One is the excessive individuality, the way we think of the God as author metaphor that makes like the author independent. And we're always talking about the author and not what is the world that gave birth to the author and allowed them to be a vehicle for the story. That's
mm,
one. The second thing, and this is combined with that sort of historical, but it's a commodification of story, right?
mm,
The idea that it's intellectual property, the idea that like you could have a story that's similar up to a certain point, and then boom, at that point, it's a money-making machine and nobody else can have it,
mm,
right? And I think that those two things together become totally corrosive and warping our idea of what a book is, right?
mm.
Instead of because the thing we think of books doing in the world now is making money, of getting attention, of getting clicks, not of what happens after it's been purchased.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And it's something, I mean, this is part of what you're saying, but it's owned by an individual.
Yeah.
Some genius wrote it, and we have no part in that genius. We can't hum like those magnets can because
No.
capitalism requires that we feel that we are unable to do
Yeah.
that.
No, we
Um,
have to receive endlessly.
yeah, yeah. One thing, Joel, just from my limited reading of your book so far, is I wondered about one thing I felt was missing so far was the telling of the story. Because you
Mm,
say wonderful things about the critical getting our critical faculties, or whatever, our thinking ability up there. And I was thinking it's sort of like a restaurant, right? And you train people to go to the restaurant and be like, oh, there's lots of corn syrup in this, and oh, they could have had some tofu. And that's great, but it's a whole different thing from actually learning to cook. And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and so I'd love personally in my little dream world, I'd love it if classics departments would get students to actually tell the Odyssey. I mean, hey,
yeah.
do it. Just because to stand in that river of images is a different thing, and it just makes it physical. But
No, you're
anyway.
absolutely right. No, 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 no. I think one of the things I say in the book is that I'm straying away from supply side poetics. That's
Mm,
my term for it, and just thinking, trying to defamiliarize us with what we think we know about story, because it is always about creation. But when I teach, my one of my primary goals is to get students engaging with the material and changing it on their own in creative ways. So the final project in my myth classes always has a creative option, and students do interesting things, come up with like dating profiles for gods, right? Video game versions, board games. I had a clue. But the point is they are narrativizing myth in a different way, trying to control it and take it. I think that these are what I think is really missing from the modern world, that the ancient world, the ancient audiences had, is a familiarity with the artistry of telling the stories. One of the things I always mention to my classes when I'm teaching Greek tragedy is that almost everybody in the audience of Greek tragedy would have performed in a Greek chorus at some point in their lives, in a religious context, when they were a child. It wouldn't have been on the main stage, but when they were kids, as a rites of initiation, they would sing in choral performances that were not dissimilar from the tragic chorus. So it's like you take a bunch of kids who played Little League every year for their life, all the way up to high school, and take them to a baseball game. It's very different to have them go to that game than to have someone who's never seen baseball before.
Yeah.
Right. And so that experience of all sides of story, I think, can be tremendously humbling. Right. And it can change the experience. You have different types of conversation. I think earlier when you were talking about the passive reception of a DVD or something on TV. Right. I mean, ancient performance of literature, what we call literature, was song culture, and it was never passive. It was always like in competition, we were judging them, right? It was an engagement, and it invited audience response in a way that a lot of our forms of entertainment don't today.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Well, that's good to hear. You're getting people being creative in there.
Well, I mean, it's part of the point of reading Greek tragedy online was offering a resource to people, but also offering a model, saying, look, the way that you should engage with tragedy is by performing it and reading it aloud and then talking about what it does to you. Because that's what happened in antiquity, right? When there was a tragic, when the city Dionysia happened and there was the competition, the tragedies, there would be 3 entries of 3 plays and a satyr play. Everybody would watch it all together in one day, and then the judges would vote and they'd award it, and everyone would talk about what happened. Right? I mean, that's so different from what we do when I give someone Oedipus Rex and sit down and they read it alone. And then I'm like, what do you make of this play? Like, what are they supposed to make of it? It's like me giving them a script to a Bollywood movie, having them read it without like seeing any of the songs or the costumes or understanding the genre itself.
Yeah. Yeah. They're supposed to occur in community, and reading takes that away, I guess.
Well, and earlier, I talked about the cognitive blending model, right? What's missing from the simple model, which is I read a story, I get my own idea of it, you read it, is that when we come together and talk about our experience of the story and our version of it, we bring our notional blends closer together. We create a community around engagement with story, around interpretation, that actually gives us a commonwealth of experience together and touch points, right? And so this is why, I don't care if people go to college and read the Iliad, but I want them to read it in book clubs, right? I want them to go and talk to their friends about it. I want them to experience it together, because that's what's meant to happen. It's not supposed to be you sitting there and reading the book, because the Iliad wasn't a book. The Iliad was a performance.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. Well, there's that story, it's in Rumi, about the blind man and the elephant in the dark room, right? When they all feel part of it, and one's like, oh, it's a snake, because they feel the tail, and one's like, it's a tree, and I find with story, that's the thing is, I mean, to use the other brief story we were talking about a princess in a castle and some guy and a dragon. It's like, I mean, somebody will listen to that and one person will be like, oh, I worked with reptiles, so I thought of the dragon, I did this, and somebody else is like, well, I built a stone wall, and when they knocked that wall down of that castle, I was like, man, that's a lot of work to build again. You know what I mean? So the community throws light on it,
but it's about, I mean, there's this example, there's a fragment on Epicurean philosophy, And it basically says something, treats a group of human community as if it's a single body. And it says, look, you cannot taste a color, you cannot feel a sound.
Mhm.
And the point is that you cannot ever actually know somebody else's experience. There's no way to translate it.
Mm.
But story and talking about story helps you create a baseline of translation from one person to another. And the point of it is that the access to truth is limited by our willingness to listen to other people's experience of the same events and of reality. Right? You may see something and it may be the equivalent to vision. I may see it, it may be the equivalent to sound. And there is no way to translate directly. But by talking about it and trusting each other, we can come closer to the truth together. And so for me, this is a powerful model against unified or unitary authoritative reading of any narrative, right? Which is that the way you get closer to the truth is by bringing lots of people together and listening to them, right? And getting them in conversation. And I think one of the things we often miss when talking about Homer is people raise up Homer as the beginning of the Western canon as this monumental thing. But they forget that in its origin, it was a performance in many different places and many different times. It was a performance for men, women, children, enslaved people, Greeks and foreigners. And the performance absorbed the interests, experiences of all these audiences and wove it into this greater fabric. And so when you look at it with just one set of eyes, you're only going to see the parts of the fabric that are like you in your experience.
Yeah.
And so for you and me to get closer to the Iliad, if there's an or Iliad or like Platonic Iliad out there, like we need each other's help and we need to bring other people into the conversation as well.
Mm. Yeah. Yes. May it be so. Um, I just got one question for you. I know you got to go. We're just opening the can. We're just
I
entering the
know we got
forest
to do
here.
this again. We got
I
to do
know
it
I
again.
have to. But I was gonna say we talked about Achilles, singing those songs,
Yeah.
in that tent, and I like just sitting there for a moment with him there, this man who's gonna kill a lot of people, and there he is singing, with those same hands. And I guess you spoke about the way we go to story to sort of to find our way, to reorient ourselves, when the world seems to be going haywire. Is there a place in the Odyssey or the Iliad which does that the most for you these days, or
Oh wow.
is that a tough
Um,
question?
it is a tough question. So there are two, and one is brutal, and one provides a hope for something else. So I'll give you both.
Mhm.
The brutal one is the beginning of book 6 of the Iliad. Menelaus has captured a man named Adrastus. Adrastus grabs his knees and asks to be ransomed back. And Agamemnon comes up and says, no, what good have the Trojans ever done to you? We need to kill them all, even the babies in their mother's wombs, right? And Agamemnon basically asks for genocide. And this is such a powerful moment because the end of book 6, you see Hector with Astyanax on the walls, his son crying at seeing his father in arms, and Hector makes this prayer that his son will be greater than he, that he will someday bring back the arms of his enemy, and everyone will praise him. But everyone in the audience knows that Astyanax will be dashed from the wall by Odysseus, or even worse, Neoptolemus will use Astyanax to bludgeon Priam to death on the altar.
Mhm.
Right. So that one, I mean, for me, watching world events and experiencing the casualization of violence against non-combatants has made the Iliad even like spark more for me. The text understands the cruelty and the wrongness of it.
Mhm.
And so that one for me just reminds me of the human capacity for horror,
Mhm.
right? But the other one that will stick with me and was sticking with me again yesterday was part of Tiresias's prophecy that gets recited in book 11 and then book 24 of the Odyssey. Tiresias goes through all the stuff, but he says, look, Odysseus, after all this is done, you have to go wandering again. And you have to go inland and you have to carry an oar with you and to get to a point where no people mistake the winnowing fan. Sorry, mistake your oar for a winnowing fan. plant the fan in the earth, and then build a temple to Poseidon there. People have talked about this a lot and what it means. But what I think it means, and I talk about this a little in my Odyssey book, and I'm still ruminating on this, is going to a place where there's a breakdown between the signifier and the signified. Going to a place where what you think stories and meaning are starts to fall apart, and rebuilding there. Right. And so for me, it's that promise, the possibility that we can escape the damage of our own narrative, so we don't have to be in the same cycles. We just have to be willing to go to a place and start anew with a new set of meaning that we'll fill up when we get there. And so it's that one. I mean, there's a man named Galen Strawson who he's a philosopher. He has an essay called Against Narrativity, where he argues against the many different trends that we have to see our lives as narratives. And in the book, in the story life, I'm a little critical of it. I say, well, it's a fiction. We're vulnerable to narrative. We're shaped by it. But I suspect I might have it wrong, right? In that, as an analytic philosopher, he's not saying that we can do it. What he's saying is that the desire to break from narrative may be an essential start. And so it's not that we need to leave stories behind us. I think it's that, the promise that if we depart and we try hard enough and travel far enough, we can tell new stories that will liberate us from the bonds that we've created in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways, the story that we can leave story behind is itself a story, right?
Of course, right, right, yeah.
There's an amazing scene in the Mahabharata epic of India where a character who has murdered many people and is basically a bad guy, we would say, goes running to Vyasa, who's the storyteller, and he says, "Is there a way out?" He says, "You're the one telling this story. You got to get me out of here because they're on my trail." And Vyasa says, there's no way out. And he gives two answers. The first one is, there's no way out because my story is the world, and it includes all things. And the second answer is more in line with Indian philosophy. It's there's no way out because as we act, so we become. And your actions determine who you are and your fate. And there's no escape from that, So where does that leave us, Joel?
On an inland journey.
On an inland journey. I'm struck, and finally, by just you told the story from the Odyssey, and it's a temple to Poseidon that is built. It's a building. It's not a town hall or an agora. It's not a place where the town can meet. It's a temple in honor of a god. And I wonder what happened to that ore. Did they take it out of the ground? Is it part of the temple? Did it end up as a?
I think it's a dedicatory offering in the corner of a temple.
Yeah, it's like a relic, maybe there.
Yeah, it is.
Wow, gosh,
it's something future archaeologists will puzzle themselves trying to figure out.
Right, or the priest to Poseidon would go every day and pass it and go that, and he'd have to remind himself that it's not a winnowing fan, but it's an ore. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's something, when I'm imagining a temple to Poseidon, right, what sticks out of my mind, even though it's inappropriate, and I don't know if you've been there, is a temple to Poseidon at Sunio, right, in Lower Attica. So it's this insane temple that was built out on a promontory. And if you go there, you look around, you're like, they dragged marble and granite. They dragged it out here in this insane act of devotion to the gods, right? And this willingness to remake the landscape at such cost of human life and energy. And there's a will to remake the world in that. That I think is coordinate in a way to a will we need to remake the world with story.
Thanks so much, Joel. This has been great.
Thank you, Jay. We'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Joel Christensen is professor of classical studies at Brandeis University. He is the author of numerous books and the creator of Reading Greek Tragedy Online, an amazing series of theatrical presentations of Greek tragedies, which he began during the COVID epidemic and is now ongoing. His most recent book, Story Life, on epic, narrative, and living things, is available now from Yale University Press. I am Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Thank you for listening, and take care.